What if I told you there's a simple checklist with just 20 items that can determine whether someone is a psychopath? 20 questions that could decide if someone ends up in prison, or on a board of directors. Sounds like a powerful tool, right? But what happens when that power is placed in the hands of people who are just as flawed, biased, and human as the rest of us? That's the twisted, fascinating world Jon Ronson invites us into in the Psychopath Test. It's not your typical psychology book. It's part detective story, part philosophical deep dive, and part self-aware satire. And through it all, Ronson is asking one unsettling question: what if the line between sanity and madness is a lot thinner and a lot more fragile than we think? Ronson's journey starts with what seems like a conspiracy thriller, a mysterious book anonymously sent to academics, filled with cryptic references and coded messages. That breadcrumb trail leads him not just to psychiatric hospitals and academic halls, but into the heart of a much bigger issue: how society defines, diagnoses, and even exploits mental illness. And in doing so, he invites us to question something many of us take for granted: our ability to tell who's normal and who's not. Have you ever met someone who just seemed off? Someone who lacked empathy, but was strangely charming? That question haunts Ronson's exploration, especially when he learns about the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. This test is used in prisons, courtrooms, and even executive coaching sessions to flag psychopathic behavior. But as Ronson quickly discovers, once you start using the checklist, you start seeing psychopaths everywhere. The line between curiosity and obsession blurs. And that's when the story shifts from investigation to introspection, because let's face it, haven't we all wondered, at some point, if we or someone we know might tick a few of those boxes? That's the genius of Ronson's storytelling. He doesn't just look outward, he turns the mirror on the reader, too. He challenges us to ask not just, who are the psychopaths, but, why are we so eager to find them? As you follow Ronson through interviews with criminally insane patients, corporate executives, and even cultish self-help gurus, you start to realize that the real danger might not be the so-called psychopaths among us, but the systems we've built to label, categorize, and control people. Systems that can be weaponized. Systems that reflect our own fears more than they reveal any absolute truth. So here's your takeaway: question the tools. Question the labels. And maybe most importantly, question your own certainty. Because in a world where anyone can be diagnosed or misdiagnosed, perhaps the real madness is thinking we're immune to it. So let's get into the core of Jon Ronson's The Psychopath Test. If you had to distill this mind-bending journey into a few essential ideas, just the 20% that gives you 80% of the insight, what would they be? What are the big takeaways, the kind that make you stop the video, stare at the wall, and rethink everything you thought you knew about mental illness, power, and human behavior? It all starts with a checklist. Not just any checklist, but the checklist, the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. Imagine being handed a list that could potentially determine someone's entire future. Prison or parole? Trustworthy or manipulative? Safe or dangerous? It's a clinical tool, developed by psychologist Robert Hare, designed to measure psychopathic tendencies based on traits like superficial charm, lack of empathy, impulsivity, and grandiosity. It's used in psychiatric hospitals, parole hearings, even corporate settings. And once Ronson gets his hands on it, something fascinating and a little terrifying happens: that he starts seeing psychopaths everywhere. Here's the twist: the more Ronson learns, the more he realizes that anyone can start to look like a psychopath when you're armed with a diagnostic tool and a bit of paranoia. It's like when you Google your symptoms and suddenly you're convinced you have some rare tropical disease. The checklist, powerful as it is, becomes a sort of lens, a filter that distorts just as much as it reveals. And that leads us to the first core insight: diagnostic tools, no matter how scientific, can easily become weapons when wielded without humility. So what's the takeaway here? Use frameworks, not verdicts. If you're someone who manages people, teaches students, or even just reads true crime obsessively, it's tempting to label. But labeling shuts down curiosity. It ends the conversation. Instead, ask, what might this behavior mean in context? What's the full story here? That shift in perspective can turn judgment into understanding. Ronson's next big theme is one that'll hit you in the gut if you've ever felt like you didn't quite fit the mold: the way society constructs madness. Over and over, he encounters people who were locked up or marginalized not because they were dangerous, but because they were weird. One man was institutionalized simply for sending cryptic messages to academics, a behavior that was certainly odd, but not necessarily harmful. And yet, the label of mentally ill was slapped on him, hard and fast. This forces us to ask, are we confusing eccentricity with pathology? How many people have been silenced, sidelined, or drugged into submission simply for being different? If you've ever been the odd one out, the black sheep, or the square peg, this hits home. It's a reminder that normal isn't always healthy and abnormal isn't always dangerous. In fact, history's greatest thinkers, artists, and innovators often walked a fine line between brilliance and what society might call madness. So here's the actionable idea: make space for difference. In your workplace, your classroom, even your family, leave room for the weird. Celebrate it. Normalize the fact that human behavior doesn't always fit into neat categories. Sometimes the person you think is off is just playing a different game, but then things get darker. Ronson starts to explore what happens when power meets pathology. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because the traits that define psychopathy, they're not always punished in our society. Sometimes, they're rewarded. In fact, Ronson meets business leaders, politicians, and executives who score disturbingly high on the checklist. They're charming, fearless, ruthless, and totally lacking in empathy. And yet, they're at the top of the food chain. That's the third bombshell: psychopaths might be running the world. Think about it. In a corporate environment where confidence is mistaken for competence, where big risks lead to big rewards, and where empathy is seen as a liability, isn't it possible, maybe even likely, that the system selects for these traits? Ronson doesn't give easy answers, but he does push us to question who we're following, and why. Are we mistaking charisma for character? Are we confusing boldness with brilliance? Here's your takeaway: check your leaders. Whether it's your boss, your politician, or your favorite influencer, ask yourself not just what they're achieving, but how. Do they show empathy? Do they take responsibility? Are they building or exploiting? Sometimes, the scariest monsters don't wear masks, they wear suits. Another layer of the book that's both hilarious and horrifying is Ronson's exploration of how the media and public discourse sensationalize madness. At one point, he looks back on his own career and realizes how much of it has involved packaging strange or unstable people into neat, digestible narratives for public consumption. And he's not alone. From tabloids to true crime podcasts, we love a good story about the unhinged mind. But that love comes at a cost: that we end up reinforcing stereotypes. We reduce complex mental health conditions to punchlines or plot twists. We forget that behind every diagnosis is a real person, with a history and a context. And worst of all, we create a culture where people are afraid to ask for help because they're afraid of being labeled. So here's your challenge: be a better storyteller. Whether you're creating content, talking with friends, or just consuming media, be mindful of how mental health is portrayed. Ask yourself, is this narrative helping someone understand, or just feeding their fear? And finally, one of the most powerful undercurrents in the book is how easy it is to fall in love with certainty. Once Ronson starts learning about psychopathy, he becomes obsessed with it. He starts using it to interpret everyone's behavior, even his own. It's tempting, right? To believe there's a hidden truth, a formula, a code that explains why people are the way they are. But that's a trap. The human mind isn't a puzzle to be solved. It's a living, evolving, often contradictory thing. And the moment we start thinking we've got it all figured out, that's when we lose our grip on reality. The truth is, people are messy. Diagnoses are flawed. And certainty? That's often just a story we tell ourselves to feel safe. So here's the final takeaway: stay curious. Embrace ambiguity. Let go of the need to categorize everyone and everything. Because the world isn't made of checklists. It's made of people. So we've journeyed through the wild terrain of the psychopath test. We've met charming manipulators, questioned our own sanity, stared into the dark heart of power, and realized just how fragile our systems for diagnosing mental illness really are. Now comes the part that matters most. What do we actually do with all of this? How do we apply these insights to the way we think, interact, lead, and live? Here's the action plan, the real-world guide you can carry with you after you put the book down. First up, be skeptical of diagnostic tools. It might seem obvious, but it's deceptively hard. We live in a world addicted to certainty: personality tests, mental health labels, behavioral checklists. They give us a sense of control, a sense that we understand what's going on. But as Jon Ronson shows us, tools like the Hare Psychopathy checklist aren't magic spells. They're fallible. They were developed in specific contexts, often forensic psychiatry, and they come with built-in limitations. When we take these tools out of their natural habitat and apply them to everyday life, the results can get weird and dangerous. So next time you find yourself thinking, that person's totally a narcissist, or I bet my boss is a psychopath, take a breath. Ask yourself, what am I basing that on? Am I seeing behavior in context, or am I just playing armchair psychologist? Real psychological assessments involve deep interviews, historical analysis, and professional training. A single trait doesn't define a person. Here's a practical shift: swap "what is this person" for "what might be motivating this behavior." It opens the door to empathy, not just judgment. Second, differentiate between eccentricity and pathology. This one hits home in a big way. Because let's be honest, our world isn't always kind to people who think differently. The more you stray from the script socially, emotionally, creatively, the more people start to squint at you, wondering if you're okay. But what if we've built systems that punish difference simply because it makes us uncomfortable? Ronson's investigation shows us how dangerously easy it is to misinterpret unconventional behavior as mental illness. A man who writes cryptic letters becomes delusional. A person with intense energy gets labeled manic. But is it possible we're just seeing the world through narrow lenses, ones that value conformity over complexity? So here's what you can do: challenge the reflex to pathologize difference. If someone acts in a way that feels off, don't assume illness, assume individuality. Try to learn before you label. In group settings, like classrooms or workspaces, create room for different thinking styles. Let quiet people speak in writing. Let fast thinkers brainstorm aloud. Value difference as a strength, not a problem to be solved. Third, resist the allure of labels. Here's the thing about labels: they stick. Once someone gets tagged as a psychopath, bipolar, borderline, or even genius, everything they do gets filtered through that frame. We stop seeing the full person. We start seeing a role. And that's dangerous, not just for them, but for us. Because when we reduce people to one word, we stop learning. We lose the richness of human complexity. Ronson's book is full of people who've been labeled in extreme ways, some fairly, others not. And the consequences? Lifelong. People are denied jobs, freedom, even dignity. All because we love neat categories. So here's a shift in behavior: catch yourself when you're reducing someone to a label. Instead of saying, he's a narcissist, try, he seems to struggle with empathy in high-pressure situations. See the nuance. Language shapes thought. The words you use determine the thoughts you allow yourself to have. Fourth, interrogate systems of power. This one's tough but essential. Because the psychopath test doesn't just point fingers at individuals, it asks us to examine the environments that reward psychopathic behavior. In business, politics, even entertainment, traits like charm, fearlessness, and ruthlessness often lead to success. But if those traits come without empathy, responsibility, or conscience, what does that say about us? About the systems we've built? Here's the uncomfortable truth: it's possible to be both effective and harmful. Charisma doesn't equal goodness. Confidence isn't the same as competence. And the higher someone climbs, the more important it becomes to ask not just what they're doing, but how they're doing it. So here's your action step: be a conscious follower. Whether you're voting, working, or scrolling your feed, pay attention to the behavior behind the performance. Look for leaders who are grounded, not just dazzling. Praise transparency over bravado. Encourage kindness over domination. Influence who gets power by redefining what power should look like. 5th, educate yourself and others on mental health narratives that we're all storytellers now. Whether it's your Instagram caption, your podcast, or the way you talk to friends, your words shape culture. And mental illness is still one of the most misunderstood topics we talk about. Ronson makes this painfully clear. He exposes how media turns mental health into spectacle. We love serial killers. We binge-watch documentaries about cults. We devour headlines about celebrity breakdowns. But every time we reduce a real condition to entertainment, we make it harder for real people to seek help. So next time you consume or create content about mental illness, ask yourself, am I humanizing this person, or am I turning them into a character? Am I sharing this story to inspire understanding, or just to shock and entertain? Be part of the solution. Share resources. Normalize therapy. Talk openly about your own struggles. Create spaces where being human isn't a risk, it's a connection. And finally, 6th, stay curious. Stay humble. This may be the biggest lesson of all. The real genius of the Psychopath Test is how it turns the spotlight back on us. It asks, why do we crave certainty so much? Why do we want so badly to believe we can divide people into categories: sane or insane, safe or dangerous, good or evil? Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's the desire to feel in control. But the truth is, people are complicated. Diagnoses are imperfect. And the line between mental health and mental illness? It's often blurry. It moves. It changes. It's influenced by culture, stress, trauma, biology, and even luck. So resist the temptation to figure everyone out. Resist the hunger for easy answers. Instead, cultivate the kind of curiosity that allows people to surprise you. That includes you. You're not a label. You're not a list of traits. You're a human being, messy, evolving, and worthy of grace. Here's something we don't always talk about when we finish a book like The Psychopath Test. What did we miss? What might we have misunderstood, or worse, taken away in exactly the opposite way the author intended? Let's get right to it. The biggest blind spot in the Psychopath Test isn't inside the story, it's in us, the readers. It's in how easily we take Ronson's ironic, investigative tone and turn it into a toolkit for diagnosing everyone around us. We're handed the Hare Checklist, and before we know it, we're scanning our coworkers, friends, exes, or that politician we can't stand, checking boxes in our heads. Lack of remorse? Check. Manipulative? Definitely. Glib and superficial charm? Oh, for sure. And suddenly we're the ones playing judge, jury, and psychologist without any of the training, and with all of the confidence. That's one of the central paradoxes of the book. Ronson is trying to show us how easy it is to get carried away with pop psychology. But in doing so, he makes the material so engaging, so accessible, that we can't help but do exactly what he warns against. He invites us to the edge of the rabbit hole and says, be careful. But some of us, let's be honest, jump straight in. The blind spot here is how seductive the narrative is. Ronson's charm as a storyteller is undeniable. He's witty, self-deprecating, skeptical in just the right places. And yet, that style can lead readers to overlook the ethical weight of what he's actually exploring. We're talking about real people, many of whom have suffered under flawed systems, people who have been mislabeled, misunderstood, or imprisoned based on shaky psychiatric evaluations. It's easy to forget that this isn't just a quirky adventure through the world of mental illness. It's a critique of institutional power. It's a warning about how systems of control can masquerade as systems of care. And if we come away from the book chuckling about how our boss might be a psychopath, instead of questioning how power structures reward pathological behavior, then we've missed the point. There's another blind spot worth mentioning, one that belongs to Ronson himself. While he's incredibly good at raising questions, he's less successful at resolving them. That's not necessarily a flaw, in fact, it's part of what makes the book feel honest. But it does leave the reader floating in ambiguity. We're introduced to serious problems like the limitations of psychiatric labels, or the exploitation of mental illness by the media, but we're not always offered a clear path forward. For some readers, that can be frustrating. There's a danger that all the nuance gets lost in the entertainment. That the line between skepticism and cynicism gets blurred. Without a solid anchor, the reader may come away feeling more paranoid than informed, more suspicious of psychiatry than critical of its misuse. So what can we do to avoid falling into this trap? The answer is surprisingly simple: slow down. Be intentional. Recognize that just because a book is entertaining doesn't mean it's light. Reflect on your reactions. Ask yourself, am I laughing because something's funny or because it's true in a way that's hard to face? Am I labeling others because it's accurate or because it makes me feel more in control? Let the book make you uncomfortable. Sit with the uncertainty. That discomfort is the point. Ronson isn't giving us answers, he's holding up a mirror. And sometimes, what we see reflected isn't the madness in others, but the madness in our own desire to simplify, to categorize, to explain away the chaos of being human. So here's the real takeaway from The Blind Spot: this isn't a book about psychopaths. It's a book about us, our biases, our fears, our need for control. It's a challenge to resist turning complex people into simple problems. And it's a reminder that the scariest thing of all might not be those who lack empathy but those who weaponize understanding without fully grasping it. So where does the Psychopath Test leave us? It's not just a book you finish, it's a question that lingers in your head long after you close the cover. Jon Ronson doesn't offer clean resolutions or moral certainties. Instead, he leaves us in that most uncomfortable, but essential, place: ambiguity, and maybe that's the point, that we want to believe that madness can be measured. That evil has a checklist. That we can draw a firm line between the sane and the insane, the villain and the victim. But reality isn't built like that. People are too complex. Systems are too messy. Labels, while sometimes helpful, can quickly become cages. If there's one lasting message here, it's this: be careful what you believe you understand. The moment we think we've got someone figured out is often the moment we stop seeing them fully. Curiosity should outweigh judgment. Empathy should precede analysis, and for those of us drawn to stories of the mind, whether out of fear, fascination, or both, Ronson offers a powerful reminder: behind every diagnosis is a person. Behind every label is a life. And behind every system meant to protect us is the potential to harm. So take the test if you must, but don't let it define your worldview. The real work is not spotting psychopaths. It's learning how to be more human, in a world that often forgets what that really means.